Two people are walking away from a garden, and they are weeping. Behind them, the gate to the only home they have ever known is closing forever, and as it swings shut, something ignites in front of it, a sword of living fire turning in every direction, held in the hand of an angel, blocking the path back inside. Adam and Eve do not look back. They cannot bear to. The way home has just been sealed with fire, and every step now carries them further into a world that is about to learn, for the very first time, the meaning of thorns and sweat and graves. That is how the story begins to go wrong on only the 3rd page of the Bible. A garden lost, a gate shut, a flaming sword standing guard over the one tree that could give them life so that no human being can ever reach it again. Now hold that image in your mind, the sword, the sealed gate, the two exiles walking east into the dark. Because I want you to remember that sword. We are going to come back to it, and where it finally ends up is going to take your breath away. Here is something almost nobody notices about the Bible. It is a library of 66 books written by dozens of authors across roughly 1,500 years on 3 different continents in 3 different languages. By every earthly measure, it should be a chaotic mess. And yet when you lay the very first pages of the Bible down next to the very last pages, something impossible happens. They match, line for line, image for image. The end of the book reaches all the way back to the beginning and answers it, closing every wound, reopening every door, and handing back to you everything that was lost on that terrible day at the gate. This is not a coincidence. This is not clever stitching by later scribes, and this is not the kind of thing a random pile of ancient documents could ever pull off by accident. This is the fingerprint of a single author who knew the ending before he ever wrote the beginning, and who wrote the last chapter of the whole human story on purpose to heal the first. The very first word of the Bible in Hebrew is Bereshit, in the beginning, and the very last book of the Bible carries a title that most people completely misunderstand. We call it Revelation, and the moment people hear that word, they picture monsters and disasters and the world going up in flames. But the Greek name of that book is Apocalypsis, and Apocalypsis does not mean destruction. It means unveiling, the pulling back of a curtain. Revelation was never mainly about how the world burns down. It is about how the curtain is finally pulled back, and behind it we see the garden again. So let us lay the 2 ends of the Bible side by side and watch them line up. It starts with the very first sentence. Genesis opens, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And near the very end, the Apostle John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." The book opens with a creation, and it closes with a whole new creation. But look closer, because the details are where this becomes stunning. In Genesis, the earth begins covered in a dark, restless, chaotic sea, the deep. To the ancient mind, the sea was the great symbol of chaos, of danger, of everything wild and threatening that could rise up and swallow you whole. And in Revelation, John describes the brand new world and adds 5 quiet words that would have made an ancient reader gasp out loud. And there was no longer any sea. The chaos is gone. The very thing that has always frightened the human heart is simply not there anymore. In Genesis, God's first spoken act is to call light into the darkness, and then he hangs a sun and a moon to rule over the day and the night. And in Revelation, John looks at the new city and says, "There is no sun and no moon, and no night at all, because the glory of God himself is the light, and the Lamb is its lamp." In the beginning, God gives us lights to push back the dark. In the end, there is no dark left for you to be afraid of at all. And then, there is the river. The word Eden in Hebrew means delight. And in that garden of delight, Genesis says a river flowed out to water the whole garden. Then turn to the final chapter of the entire Bible, and John sees it once more. A river of the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing right out from the throne of God, straight down the middle of the city. It is the same river. It was in the first garden, and it is in the last city. It never actually vanished. It was only waiting for you to come home to it. But you cannot really understand the ending until you understand what went wrong in the beginning. Because between that first garden and that final city, something shattered. A creature slipped into the garden. The Bible calls him the serpent, and by the time you reach the last book, it names him without flinching, the ancient serpent, the devil Satan. He arrived with a whisper and a question. Did God really say? And he talked the first man and the first woman into the one act God had begged them to avoid. They reached for the one tree he had told them to leave alone. And the instant they did, the entire world cracked down the middle. Watch everything that broke in that single moment. Shame arrived for the first time ever. They saw that they were naked, and they hid, and they sewed fig leaves together to try to cover themselves. Fear arrived. They heard the sound of God walking in the garden, in the cool of the day, the way he always had, and this time they ran and hid from the footsteps of the very one who loved them most. And then came the curse. God pronounced it over all of it. Pain would flood into childbirth. The ground itself would fight back with thorns and thistles. Work would turn into sweat and struggle and exhaustion. And worst of all, death entered the world that had never known it. Phew, dust you are, God said, and to dust you will return. The first graves were now on their way, and then the sword. To keep them from reaching out and eating from the tree of life and living forever in their broken, fallen condition, God drove them out of the garden, and he stationed mighty angels and that flaming turning sword to guard the way to the tree. Read those words slowly: to guard the way. The way to life was now blocked by fire, and for the next thousands of years of the story, through every patriarch and prophet and king, that sword never moves. The way home stays shut. Humanity is left living east of Eden in exile, haunted by the memory of a garden we could never find our way back into. But even in the middle of pronouncing the curse, God dropped a promise. He told the serpent that one day a child born of the woman would crush his head even as the serpent struck at his heel. It was the very first promise of a rescuer spoken right over the wreckage of the very first sin. A single thread of hope dropped on the third page of the Bible that the entire rest of the story would slowly pull tight. If you are starting to see how all of these pieces fit together, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button right now, because we are about to watch that ancient promise come true and watch every single thing that was lost at the gate come flooding back in the final chapters, including that sword. Stay with me, because what happens to the flaming sword is the single most beautiful reversal in the whole Bible. So, come to the last 2 pages of Scripture and watch the author undo the damage one wound at a time. The curse itself, John writes the 4 words that reverse the entire tragedy. No longer any curse. Gone. The very thing that fell on everything in Eden is simply lifted back off of everything in the end. Death and all the graves it dug. John hears a great voice thunder from the throne, saying that God will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, and no more pain. Because the old order of things, that whole cursed system, has finally passed away for good. Every funeral you have ever stood at, every grave you have ever wept beside, every goodbye you were sure was final. The last chapter of the Bible stamps an expiration date on all of it. The shame, the hiding, the fig leaves. In the beginning, they hid their faces from God in fear. And in the end, John writes that God's servants will see his face with their own eyes, and his own name will be written across their foreheads. No more hiding, no more covering up, no more fig leaves. Just your face lifted up, looking straight into the face of God, with nothing left in you to be ashamed of. And the exile itself, that terrible distance, God on one side of a sealed gate and us on the other, listen to the loudest promise in the entire last book. A great voice from the throne cries out, "Look, the dwelling place of God is now among the people. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them." Do you feel the weight of that? In the beginning, God walked with man in the garden, and then we were driven out. In the end, God does not merely call you back up to him. He comes all the way down and he moves in to be with you forever. And there is a wedding. It is easy to miss, but the very first thing that ever happened in that garden was a marriage. God brought the woman to the man, and the human story opened with a husband and a wife. And how does the whole Bible end with a wedding? John hears heaven roar, the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And then he watches the New Jerusalem itself come down out of heaven, and the Bible describes the city as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. The story that opened with the first marriage closes with the final one, and this time the groom is God himself, and the bride is his people, which means the bride is you. And this marriage never ends. There is even a strange, small detail most people skip right over. In Genesis, when it describes the land around Eden, it mentions almost in passing that there was gold there, and it was good, along with precious onyx stones. A quiet little hint of gold and jewels at the very start. And when John describes the final city, he can barely find the words for it, a city of pure gold, clear as glass, with 12 foundations set with every kind of precious gemstone, and 12 gates, each one carved from a single enormous pearl. The faint glimmer of gold and stone in the first garden becomes an entire city of it in the end. God does not just restore what was lost. He magnifies it beyond anything the first garden ever held. And think about what humanity was given at the very start. In Genesis, God hands the first man and woman a crown of sorts. He tells them to rule, to have dominion, to reign over the whole of creation as his image bearers. And then sin stripped that crown away, and instead of ruling the earth, we were ruled by thorns and toil and death. But look at the final lines of the last book. John writes that God's people will reign with him forever and ever. The crown that fell off in Eden is placed back on our heads in the end. What Adam lost, the second Adam wins back and hands to you. And the serpent, the deceiver who started this whole disaster, John watches him get thrown down into the lake of fire, defeated, finished, silenced, never again to whisper another lie into your ear, or anyone's, ever again. The head that struck in Eden is at last permanently crushed. That first promise dropped on the third page comes true on the second to last. And then, the two things from the garden that matter most of all. The river returns flowing straight out from the throne right down the center of the city. And there beside it, growing on both banks of that river, is a tree, the tree of life. The very tree that was sealed away behind a wall of turning fire on the third page of the Bible is standing wide open in full view on the second to last page. And its leaves, John says, are for the healing of the nations. The tree you lost is the exact tree you get back. But wait, how does anyone get past the sword? Remember, God set that flaming sword there for one specific reason, to guard the way to the tree of life. So how, by the end of the story, is the way suddenly wide open again? What on earth happened to the sword? Here's the answer the entire Bible had been driving toward from the beginning. In the middle of the story, a man stood up and said 7 words that no one had ever dared to say. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The way. It is the exact word from the gate of Eden. The way to the tree had been blocked by fire, and he stood up and said, I am the way. And then he walked up a hill and he let the sword of judgment fall on himself instead of on us. He took the flaming sword into his own body so that the gate which had been sealed shut with fire could finally swing back open for you. This is what a 2nd century teacher named Irenaeus meant when he described what Jesus did using one enormous idea recapitulation. He taught that Jesus was the second Adam who went back and lived out the whole human story again. From the inside, and everywhere the first Adam had failed, the second Adam succeeded in his place. Where the first Adam reached out to a tree and brought death to everyone, the second Adam was nailed to a tree and brought life back to you. The Bible itself says it plainly. As in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. That is why on the final page, John can write that if you have been washed clean, you now have the right to the tree of life, and you may walk straight through the gates into the city. The sword is gone. The gate is open. The way home has been cleared, because someone walked into the fire ahead of you. And maybe this finally explains something you have felt your entire life and never had the words for. That strange ache, that homesickness for a place you cannot quite name. The quiet sense down underneath everything that this world is beautiful but broken, that this is not quite how things were supposed to be, that you were made for something more than this. Nearly every human heart carries it, a longing for a home that none of us has ever actually seen. And the Bible says that longing is not a defect in you. It is a memory. You are homesick for Eden. You were made for a garden your first parents lost, and you have spent your whole life without even knowing it, aching to find your way home. And the last pages of the Bible are God's own promise that one day you will. So, let us bring it home with 3 things to carry out of here with you. First, the Bible is not 66 random books stapled together at the spine. It is one single story with a beginning and an ending that were built to match each other on purpose. The Garden of Genesis and the City of Revelation are 2 halves of one picture, and the author wrote the last chapter specifically to answer the first. Once you see that the whole book stops being a pile of ancient writings and becomes what it always was, a rescue story, with your own name written somewhere inside it. Second, you are living in the middle of that story right now, not back in the garden that was lost and not yet inside the city that is coming, but in the long, aching chapter in between east of Eden where the exile still feels painfully real. And that means the brokenness you feel in your life is not proof that the story failed. It is the sign that you are living in the middle, and the middle was always going to hurt, but the middle is not the end. And third, this is the one to hold on to tonight. Every single thing that was lost in the garden, God is not only bringing back, He is bringing back greater. The river, the tree, His presence, your home. And the flaming sword that once kept you locked out was taken up and absorbed by the very one who loved you enough to walk into the fire in your place. You are not being sent backward to Eden. You are being carried forward to something far greater than Eden ever was, a garden grown up into a city with God Himself, living right in the middle of it, and no gate and no sword and no more goodbye. So tell me down in the comments which of these mirrors hit you the hardest. The river, the tree, or the face of God at the very end? Let me know below. I want to hear it. The Bible opens with a gate swinging closed and 2 people walking away from God into the dark. And it ends with the gates of a city that will never close again, thrown wide open, and God running out through them to meet the very people who once had to leave. The whole book, from the first word to the very last, was always the story of how He gets you home.